The beast had already closed the circle by the time the horns went quiet. It moved the way weather moves, low and gray and inevitable, 6 legs eating the sand of the culling floor in a slow orbit that pulled tighter with every pass. 2,000 Casri looked down from the tiers of the gray hold and did not breathe. On the high bench, 9 adjudicators sat in their pale robes like teeth in a jaw, and every one of them leaned forward to watch the animal they called an instrument do the one thing it had been kept alive to do. In the center of that shrinking circle stood a young man in a stained work smock, and he was not running. His name was Jonah Verrill, and he was 22 years old, and his hands hung open at his sides. He had a plain face, the kind you would forget in a crowd, a broad nose, a chipped front tooth, hair the color of wet straw cut short by his own knife. He did not look like a man who could stop a Rendar. He did not look like a man who could stop anything. That was the point of the whole spectacle. The Casri had dressed the floor in blood lamps, and called the tiers full so that the galaxy could watch a soft animal die under a hard one, and understand, in that watching, exactly what the adjudicate thought a human being was worth. The beast made its last pass and stopped. It stood taller at the shoulder than any Casri in the hold, plated in slate-gray armor that had grown over its hide the way bark grows over a wound, 6 legs, a skull like a splitting maw, and set behind its heavy jaw on the left side, an ear that had been torn once and healed wrong, curled and notched and pale at the edge, the only soft thing on the entire animal. The beast lowered its head. Sand hissed off its crest. Somewhere in the tiers, a young Casri clerk pressed both hands to his mouth. And the young man in the stained smock did not step back. He took a breath, and he lifted his open hand, slow, the way you lift a hand to a thing that has decided to kill you, and he reached across the last of the distance toward that torn and ruined ear. To understand why he did that, why a condemned human would walk toward the worst animal in the gray hold and offer it his hand instead of his throat, you have to go back 6 weeks, to a sound in the dark that nobody else in the pens would answer. It had started with a cough. The Rendar pen sat beneath the gray hold like a second stomach, 3 levels of iron cells sunk into the world's cold rock, and at the deepest level the air tasted of ammonia and old meat, and the particular flat mineral smell of animals that never saw sky. Jonah had been down there 4 months by then. He had come off a human hauler called the Marrow, boarded and taken in the shipping lanes past Vantes for the crime of carrying cargo the Casri had decided, after the fact, that they owned. The crew had been sorted the way the Casri sorted everything, by usefulness. The pilots went to the reclamation yards. The medics went to the physicians' halls, where their hands were valued and their names were not. And Jonah, who had grown up on a stock barge castrating bullocks and pulling calves and sitting up all night with sick animals because there was no one else to do it, had been marked with the pale brand of the beast service and sent down into the pens to shovel and haul and die of something eventually. He had not expected to mind the animals. He minded the Casri. The cough came again, wet and low, from the far cell on the deepest ring, and Jonah stopped with the muck-barrow half-turned and listened. He had learned in 4 months to tell the pen sounds apart. There was the high whistling of the ven hounds when they were hungry, which was always. There was the drum of the war beasts throwing themselves at their doors, which meant a shift change, which meant food. And there was this, a deep, cracked, effortful cough, the sound of a big animal trying to clear something that would not clear, and under it a sound he had only ever heard from cattle at the very end. A low, steady groaning on the out-breath, the sound an animal makes when the pain has stopped being an event and become the weather. He knew whose cell it was. Everyone in the pens knew whose cell it was. They called the animal the instrument when they gave it a name at all, and mostly they didn't. It was the biggest Rendar in the gray hold, older than the goad masters who tended it, and it was the animal the adjudicate used when it wanted a death to mean something. When a criminal was sentenced to the culling floor, the instrument was the one they brought out. It had killed, the other pen hands whispered, more sentience than any single Kasrai in the history of the hold, and it had done it slowly, because that was what the crowds came for, and because that was what the goads made it do. Nobody fed it if they could send someone else. Nobody mucked its cell without two goad masters standing by, and nobody went near it in the dark. Jonah set the barrow down. He should have logged the cough and moved on. That was the rule, and the rule existed because the last pen hand who had gotten curious about the instrument had gone home with one arm. But Jonah had spent his whole short life listening to animals in the dark, and there is a thing that happens to a certain kind of person when they hear an animal in real pain. A thing that overrides sense, that walks the body toward the sound before the mind has finished voting. He picked up the small hooded lamp, turned it to its lowest ember, and walked down the ring toward the cell nobody would open. The smell hit him first, not the pen smell. Underneath it, sharp and sweet and rotten, the smell of a wound gone wrong. He stopped a body's length from the bars and let the lamp's weak light find the animal, and for a moment his heart simply refused the size of it. The instrument filled the cell the way a storm front fills a valley. It lay on its side against the far wall, all 6 legs drawn up, and even lying down its shoulder rose higher than Jonah's head. Its hide was the gray of old iron, plated and seamed, scarred in 100 places by claws and blades and the small round burns of the goad. Its ribs moved too fast, and when the lamp touched its face, one eye rolled and found him, an eye the deep amber of resin with the light caught in it, an eye that held him and measured him and did not, in that moment, have any menace left over to spend. The animal was sick, and it was in agony, and it was completely alone in the dark, and it had been for longer than Jonah had been alive. "Easy," Jonah said. It came out of him without permission, lo, the 2 soft syllables he'd said to 1,000 frightened animals in his life. "Easy now, I'm not going to touch you." The beast's lips peeled back off teeth as long as his fingers. The groan climbed into something with an edge on it, but it did not surge up. It did not throw itself at the bars. It lay there and warned him and kept its terrible eye on his face, and Jonah understood, the way he understood weather and calving and the exact moment a bullock decides to bolt, that the animal was not warning him away. It was warning him that it was hurt, the way a hurt thing warns you, because a warning is the last thing it has. He crouched down slow, keeping his hands where the amber eye could see them, and he started to talk. He told it nonsense, mostly. He told it about the marrow and the bullocks and the cold. He told it that the cough sounded like the rattles his grandfather used to get, and that his grandfather had been the meanest animal on the barge and had also, secretly, kept a lame gull alive in a crate for 6 years, and that Jonah figured most mean things were just hurt things that had run out of people who'd sit with them. He told it he wasn't going to open the door because he wasn't stupid and because it would kill him, and he didn't hold that against it. He told it the light was going to stay low. He told it he'd come back. The whole time the amber eye watched him, and somewhere in the middle of all that low, pointless talk, the groaning on the out-breath got quieter. Not gone, quieter. The great ribs slowed by a fraction. The lips came down over the teeth. That was all. That was the whole of the first night. A young man crouched in the dark talking rubbish to a monster, and the monster listening, because no one in the history of its captivity had ever sat down in front of it and simply stayed. When the shift bell rang above and Jonah finally stood, his knees cracked, and the beast's eye tracked him up. He lifted the lamp a fraction and got his first clear look at the source of the rotten smell. Behind the left ear, in the soft hollow where the jaw met the skull, a metal collar plate had been bolted into the bone, and driven down through the center of that plate, deep into the nerve root beneath, was a black iron spike the length of Jonah's hand. A goad spike. The Kasrai drove them into the war beast's young and left them there for life. A current run through the spike lit up the nerve like a struck match, and that was how a thing the size of a grain silo was made to do tricks in front of a crowd. This one spike had shifted. The plate had loosened over the years, and the spike had worked sideways in the wound, and the flesh around it had gone the black-green of deep infection, weeping down the animal's neck. Every breath moved the jaw. Every movement of the jaw moved the spike. The animal was being tortured slowly, by the very device that made it useful, and no Kasrai had noticed or cared, because the instrument only had to work one more time, and then they would put it down and grow another. Jonah looked at that wound for a long moment. "All right," he said quietly. "All right, I see it." Then he picked up his barrow and his lamp, and he went back up into the cold, and he did not sleep, because he had already decided the one thing that was going to get him killed. It took him 9 days to touch it. He did not rush, because you do not rush a thing that can take your arm off, and because the plan he was building in the back of his head, a plan he did not yet dare say to himself as a plan, depended on doing it right. So he came back. Every night, after the last goad master had climbed the stairs, and the pens had gone to their uneasy dark, Jonah came down the ring with his low lamp and sat in front of the instrument cell and talked. He learned the animal. He learned that it hated the sound of boots and loved, if love is the word, the sound of his voice pitched low and even, that its ears, the good right one and the ruined left, tracked him around the cell before its eyes bothered to, that when he came near it flinched not toward him but away, curling its enormous head down and to the side, protecting the wounded ear, because in all its long life the only hands that had ever come toward that ear had come to hurt it. He brought it water it would drink from his flat palm through the bars. He brought it, on the 4th night, a strip of clean meat off his own ration, and watched it take the meat from his fingers with a delicacy that no one who had only seen it on the floor would have believed, its lips barely brushing his skin. On the 6th night he named it. He hadn't meant to. He was talking about the barge again, about a gray plow ox his family had kept that was too old to work and too stubborn to die, a mean-eyed brute named Bram that had once stood over a fallen calf all night in a blizzard and killed a snowcat that came for it. "You put me in the mind of him," Jonah told the beast. "Same eyes. Same idea about the world." The beast's good ear swiveled at the sound, and Jonah said the name again, softer, Bram, and the amber eye half closed, and after that the name was simply true. On the 9th night he opened the cell. He knew what it might cost him. He had thought about it in the cold for 9 days. But the wound was worse. The black weep had spread down to the shoulder, and the great animal had stopped eating, and Jonah had seen enough dying to know that Bram had maybe a week before the infection reached the blood and took him screaming. And there was a second thing, a thing Jonah barely let himself look at directly, which was that he did not want to live in a place where the answer to a thing like Bram was to let it rot. He drew the bolt, the door swung. And Jonah Verrill, 22 years old, unarmed, walked into a cell with the animal that had killed more sentients than the plague, and knelt down beside its ruined ear. Bram went rigid. Every plate on his body stood up. The growl that came out of him was not a sound so much as a pressure, a thing Jonah felt in his teeth and his chest and the soles of his feet. And for one long second the young man knelt with his hand a finger's width from that black wound, and understood exactly how easy it would be to die. "Easy," he breathed. "Easy, Bram, I know it hurts. I'm going to make it stop. That's all I'm ever going to do to you, make it stop." He did not touch the spike, not yet. He laid the back of his hand the back, so the animal could see it held nothing. So the first touch was soft and knuckled and harmless against the good plating of Bram's cheek, well away from the wound, and he left it there, and he did not move. Bram shook. The whole vast body of him trembled like a struck bell. And then, by degrees, over a length of time Jonah could not afterward have measured, the trembling gentled, and the plates came down, and the enormous skull settled by a fraction into the cup of Jonah's hand. Jonah turned his hand over and touched the torn ear. It was the softest part of the animal, and the most ruined, warm and swollen and slick at the edge of the wound. And when Jonah's fingers found the base of it, Bram made a sound no one in the gray hold had ever heard the instrument make, a low, broken, questioning sound up at the end, like a word in a language with only one word in it. Jonah kept his fingers there, feather-light, tracing the healthy skin around the horror of the spike, and he began very quietly to work. He did it the way he'd lanced abscesses on the barge, patient and merciful and unhurried, talking the whole time. He eased the infection where it had pooled. He worked the loosened plait of hair at a time until the spike stopped grinding the nerve. He could not pull the spike. That would have killed the animal and probably him. But he could stop it from moving, and he could clean what he could reach, and he could pack the wound with the antiseptic salve. He had been stealing a thumb's width at a time from the physician's waist for 9 days. Bram let him. That was the thing Jonah would remember to the end of his life. The animal that the whole hold feared lay in the dark and let a soft-handed human boy dig in its worst wound, and it did not close its jaws, and the only sound it made was that low questioning note, over and over, as if it could not understand what was happening to it, as if being helped was so far outside its experience of the universe that it kept checking to see if the hand would turn. The hand did not turn. When it was done, Jonah sat back on his heels, filthy to the elbow, shaking with the afterfear he hadn't let himself feel, and Bram turned his enormous head and looked at him and pressed the whole weight of that head, slow and deliberate, into Jonah's chest and held it there. The blunt force of it rocked Jonah back against the wall. It should have crushed his ribs. It didn't. The animal had measured it exactly. "Yeah," Jonah said when he could talk. His voice was not steady. He put both arms around as much of the great gray skull as he could reach, careful of the ear. "Yeah, I've got you. Easy, Bram. I've got you." He did not know it, but 3 levels up, a young Kasrai warden named Ith had been standing at the top of the stairs for the last 10 minutes, watching on the pen's old flickering sensor feed, forgetting entirely to breathe. Ith was new. Ith still, at that point in his short career, believed most of what the adjudicate told him about the order of things, that the instrument was a machine of meat, that it felt nothing a Kasrai would recognize, that a human was a clever animal and nothing more. He watched the feed, and he watched the instrument press its head into the human's chest like a pup into its dam, and he felt the first hairline crack open in everything he believed, and he told no one, and he did not know yet why. After that, Bram healed, and Jonah learned what the gray hold was really for. The wound closed over the next 2 weeks, the black weep drying to a scab and then to a seam of new gray plating, and with the pain gone the animal changed. Not softened, Jonah would never have used that word about Bram, and he corrected any pen hand who did, because a soft animal is one that has stopped being what it is, and Bram had not stopped being anything. He was still the largest, oldest, most dangerous Rendar in the hold. He still killed on the floor when they made him. But in the dark, on Jonah's shift, he was awake in a way he had not been for years, and his amber eye followed the young man down the ring the way a dog's eye follows the one person in the house who is theirs. And the other beasts noticed. Jonah felt it before he understood it. He would come down the ring with the barrow and the whole level would go quiet, not the cowed quiet of the goad shifts, but an attentive quiet, ears turning, eyes tracking. The Venhounds stopped throwing themselves at their doors when he passed. A young war beast 3 cells down, a scarred thing the goad masters had half broken and called hopeless, began to press its flank to the bars when Jonah walked by, wanting the flat of his hand. He gave it. He couldn't not give it. And the animal that a week before had been a hopeless case took its meat from his fingers and stopped screaming through the night shifts. And the goad masters wrote in their logs that the specimen was responding to conditioning, and none of them wondered whose. It was Ith who worked it out first, because Ith was watching the feeds now, all of them on his own time, unable to stop. What the young warden saw and could not unsee was that the beasts of the gray hold were not machines of meat. They were not responding to conditioning. They were choosing. Given, for the first time in their lives, a single point of gentleness in a universe of goads, every predator on the deepest ring was orienting on it the way iron filings orient on a stone, not because they had been trained, but because something older than training in them recognized a thing they had no other word for, and the closest word the Kasrai had for it was one they never used about a human, and the word was safe. Ith did not report it. He told himself it was because the report would sound insane. That was half of it. The other half he did not look at. Then Bram's mate whelped, and everything Jonah had built in the dark came due at once. Nobody had known she was carrying. She was a smaller Rendar 2 rings up, a floor beast like Bram, and the Kasrai bred their instruments the way they did everything, by ledger and without ceremony. And by the time a goad master noticed her swollen, and off her feed it was nearly done. She threw a single pup in the small hours of a cold shift, and she threw it wrong. And by the time Jonah heard the trouble and came at a run she was dying and the pup was cold on the stone and not breathing. He didn't think. He was through the cell door, and on his knees in the birth mess with his hands full of a slick gray body no bigger than a hound, clearing its mouth, rubbing it hard against the grain of its wet hide, the way he'd rubbed 100 slow calves into the world, breathing into the flat of its face, swearing at it, begging it, until it kicked and coughed and dragged in a first shuddering breath, and let out a thin, furious cry that echoed off the iron. The mother died anyway. Nothing he did was going to change that. She'd torn something inside that no hands could reach. But she lived long enough to turn her great head and see her pup breathing in the human's arms, and she made, before she went, a low sound down the ring, and 2 rings below in the dark, Bram answered it. One note. It carried through the whole stone gut of the hold, and every animal in the pens fell silent to hear it. And Jonah, kneeling in the blood with the tiny screaming pup against his chest, understood that he was holding Bram's son. He named the pup Fen later, for no reason except that it was small and quick and the name fit in the mouth. But first he had to keep it, and to keep it he had to hide it, because at the change of shift the goad master who found the dead mother made a note in his ledger, and the note said cull the whelp. They culled pups routinely. A Rendar took years to grow to floor size, and a pup born off schedule was a cost with no return, and the Kasrai did not sentimentalize costs. The order would be carried out that same shift by whichever pen hand drew it, and it would be done with a rod, and it would be logged and forgotten. Jonah drew the order. Of course he drew it, and he stood in the muck room with the warm, shaking pup buttoned inside his smock against his skin, and he looked at the ledger slate with the cull order lid on it, and he did the thing that everything after came out of. He logged the cull as complete. He pressed his brand to the slate and marked the whelp destroyed. And then he carried Bram's living son down the ring in the dark, past the silent watching beasts, and he held the pup up to the bars of Bram's cell so the great animal could smell his own blood alive on the human's hands. Bram lowered his enormous head to the bars. His nostrils worked. The good ear came forward and the ruined ear tried to. And the sound he made then was the questioning note again, the one-word language up at the end. But there was a whole sentence under it this time, and Jonah heard it because he had spent his life learning to hear it. I know, Jonah said, his throat was tight. I know I'll keep him, I swear to you, I'll keep him alive. He raised the pup a fraction higher, and Bram, very gently through the bars, touched the flat of his blunt nose to his son's back, once, and then to the back of Jonah's hand. And the scent of that moment, the pup, the blood, the salve, the boy, printed itself into the old animal's brain in a place the goads had never been able to reach, and it would still be there 6 weeks later, on the culling floor, when Bram was starved and blind with fury, and needed one true thing in all the world to reach for. Up at the top of the stairs, on the flickering feed, Warden Ith watched a condemned pup breathe against a human's chest, and a killer touch its nose to a hand, and he reached out and with one gray finger, quietly deleted the sensor log for that shift before anyone else could see it. He would wonder later, when it all came apart, exactly when he had changed sides. He decided in the end that it was that night, not with a decision, not with a speech, just a finger on a slate, erasing the evidence of a mercy because he could not stand to be the reason it was punished. Fen grew fast, the way predators grow, and hiding him got harder every day. Jonah kept him in the disused flood cistern behind the deepest ring, a black, wet room the goad masters never went into because it stank and served no purpose, and he fed him from his own ration, and from meat he lifted a scrap at a time from the beast's feed, and he came to him twice a shift, and the pup imprinted on him the way pups do, hard and total and permanent. Within a fortnight Finn would follow him at a bounding scramble the length of the cistern, and climb his leg and lie along his shoulders with his growing weight draped down Jonah's back like a stole, churring that same low questioning note he had learned from his sire without ever hearing it. And that was the danger, because Finn had learned other things from Jonah too, and the deepest one was that the human was the center of the world, and a Rendar does not keep that kind of knowledge quiet. The beasts of the pens knew there was a pup. They could smell him, hear him, and they knew he was Bram's, and something in the whole population shifted around the fact of a Rendar whelp being raised in the dark by the soft-handed human they had all, in their separate cells, decided was theirs. The night shifts went quieter and stranger. The war beasts began to face the same direction when Jonah worked toward him, always toward him, a whole level of apex predators turning like flowers. A goad master noticed and could not explain it and put it in a report that went nowhere. Jonah knew he was living on borrowed time. He was not a fool. He counted the days he had left before someone reconciled a ledger or reviewed a feed or simply looked into the wrong dark room, and he knew the number was small, and he made, in the counting of it, a quiet peace with the shape of what would happen to him. What he could not make peace with was what would happen to Finn, and to Bram, and so he kept doing the only thing he knew how to do, which was to be, for the animals in that terrible place, the one point of gentleness in the dark, for as long as they let him. It lasted 41 days from the night he lanced the wound. On the 41st day, the goad master named Vesk came down to the deepest ring in the middle of Jonah's shift, and he brought the goad. Vesk was old for a goad master, which meant he was good at it, which meant he had survived 30 years of a job that killed the careless, and he had done it by never once mistaking an animal for anything but a tool that could hurt him back. He was tall even for a Kasrai, gray-chitined and stooped, with the 4 eyes of his kind set close and cold in a narrow face, and he wore at his belt the long, insulated haft of a hand goad, a rod that ended in a paired set of contacts he could lay against a beast's plating to run a current straight to the spike behind its ear. He was not cruel the way a small man is cruel for pleasure. He was cruel the way a scale is heavy, as a simple fact of what he was, without heat, which was worse. He had come down to test the instrument. The adjudicate had passed a sentence that morning. Jonah did not know on whom then, and the floor was booked for the coming 5th day, and it was Vesk's job to make sure the instrument was in working order. Working order to Vesk meant a specific thing. It meant the animal would kill on command slowly for a crowd, and stop on command, and it meant you confirmed that by running the goad and watching the beast writhe and knowing you still owned the switch. Jonah was mucking the 3rd cell down when he heard the current whine and Bram scream. He had heard Bram make sounds no one else had heard. He had never heard this one. It was the sound of the healed nerve lighting up all at once under the spike Jonah had spent 9 days easing, the whole ruined ear on fire again, and it went through Jonah like the current itself. He came around the corner of the ring with the muck fork still in his hands and saw Vesk standing at Bram's bars with the goad haft thrust through and laid against the animal's neck plate, leaning into it, 4 eyes half closed in professional concentration, while Bram convulsed against the far wall with his 6 legs scrabbling and his jaws wide, and that terrible sound tearing out of him. "Stop," Jonah said. Vesk did not turn. Pen hands did not speak to goad masters. The word simply did not compute as something that had been said to him, and he leaned a fraction harder into the rod, and Bram's scream cracked and climbed. "I said stop." Jonah was moving before he'd decided to. "The spike's seated wrong, you'll tear the stop. You're going to kill him doing that." Vesk pulled the rod back then, not because Jonah had said anything but because the test was complete, and he turned his 4 cold eyes on the human with the muck fork, and considered him the way you consider a sound your equipment has started making. "The specimen," he said, in the flat, over-precise Casserai way, "spoke to me. It's mishandled." Jonah made himself lower the fork. His hands were shaking and his voice, he was distantly proud to notice, was not. "The goad plate's loosened. The spike moves in the wound. You run full current through a shifted spike and you'll rupture the nerve root, and then your instrument dies frothing on the floor in front of the whole hold, and they'll ask you why. I've been treating it. It's sound now if you handle it right. You don't have to do it like that." It was the wrong thing to say, and Jonah knew it even as it left him, because he had just told a 30-year goad master 3 things at once: that a pen hand had been in the instrument's cell, that a pen hand had put hands on the adjudicate's property, and that a pen hand thought he knew the animals better than the master did. Any one of them was a flogging. All 3 together was something else. But Vesk did not call the wardens. Not yet. Because Vesk was, above all, a professional, and something in what the human had said had snagged on his professional attention. He looked at the healed seam of new plating behind Bram's ear, where the black weep had been for years, that he had assumed was simply the animal's long rot. He looked at the human, and Jonah watched a very old and very cold mind put 2 facts side by side and arrive, without any warmth at all, at a use. "Show me," Vesk said. So Jonah showed him. God help him, he showed him. Vesk made him go into the cell with 2 wardens on the door now, and the goad live in Vesk's hand. And Jonah knelt by Bram's shaking head and put his hand on the ruined ear and brought the great animal down out of its fury with his voice. "Lo. Easy, Bram, easy, I've got you. He's done, it's done." Until the plates lay flat and the amber eye cleared, and the animal pressed its skull, trembling, into the human's chest in front of the goad master and the 2 wardens. And one of the wardens made a small sound, and the other looked away. Vesk watched all of it with his 4 eyes and his cold ledger of a mind, and when Jonah stood he said only, "Interesting," and turned and climbed the stairs, and Jonah knew with total certainty that he had just done something far more dangerous than talk back. He had shown them a better goad. For 2 days after that, Jonah lived inside the strange quiet that comes before a storm you can see coming and cannot outrun, and the animals felt it before he did. They always felt it first. That was a thing Jonah had learned young and relearned in the pens, that a beast reads the weather of the people around it long before the people admit there is weather, and by the morning after Vesk climbed the stairs saying interesting, the whole deepest ring had gone taut in a way that had nothing to do with feeding or shift bells. The venhounds paced. The war beasts stood at their bars with their eyes on the stairs. And when Jonah came down for his shift they turned to him, all of them, the way they always turned to him, but harder now, closer. A whole level of predators leaning toward the one soft thing in their world as if they had understood, in whatever way an animal understands such things, that the soft thing was in danger, and that danger to the soft thing was the one danger their whole broken lives had left them unwilling to abide. The scarred war beast 3 cells down was the worst of them. It was the one the goad masters had called hopeless, the one they had half broken and written off, a big, raw-boned brute with a coat like burnt iron, and a temperament the logs described as unrecoverable. It had come to Jonah slowly over the weeks, flanked to the bars, wanting the flat of his hand, and it had stopped screaming through the night shifts, and Jonah had come to think of it as one of his even though he had never dared open its door. On the second morning after Vesk, Jonah came down the ring to find a goad master named Coral standing at the war beast's bars with the hand goad out, because the animal had refused its feed and refused to be moved, and the log said the specimen was regressing, and the remedy for regression was current. "Don't," Jonah said, and Coral, younger than Vesk and greener and therefore more afraid, spun with the goad up. "Stand off, pen hand, specimen's non-compliant." It's not non-compliant, it's frightened, Jonah said. He kept his hands open and his voice low, and he did not stop walking, slow, up the ring. Something's got the whole level spooked, and it's rolling downhill onto the ones who have been hurt worst. And this is one of the ones who have been hurt worst. And if you put current in it right now, you're going to teach it all over again that the worst thing in its world is a casrai with a rod, and then you really will have a regression, and it'll be one you made. He reached the bars easy between the goad master and the animal, and he put his back to the war beast, his back, to a half-broken apex predator, in front of a goad master who could not believe what he was seeing. And he laid his open hand flat on the burnt iron flank through the bars, and the great scarred animal, which had refused its feed, and refused to move and been marked unrecoverable, leaned the whole trembling weight of itself into the human's palm and let out a long, shuddering breath, and went quiet. Coral stared. "How did you?" "I didn't do anything," Jonah said, which was true and which no casrai in that place would ever be able to believe. "I just didn't hurt it. You should try it sometime. Costs less than the current." He did not say it unkindly. He never said anything unkindly. That was half of what unnerved them. He took his hand off the flank, and the war beast made a low sound after it, wanting it back, and Jonah said over his shoulder in the voice, "Easy, easy, I'm right here. Eat your feed and I'll come back on the night shift." And the animal, impossibly, turned and went to its feed and ate. Coral logged it as the pen hand demonstrating an unauthorized handling technique, and took the log up the stairs, and it landed on the same desk Vesk's report had landed on, and it was one more line in the ledger that was already, without Jonah fully knowing it, being footed toward the floor. Up on the warden's level, Ith read Coral's log the moment it came in, and he sat with it a long time. He had stopped pretending by then that he did not know what he was watching. He had watched the feeds for weeks. He had seen the whole deepest ring turn toward the human like grass toward light. He had seen a specimen marked unrecoverable recover under an open hand in an afternoon, and he had seen a goad master unable to describe it except as a technique, because technique was the only word the casrai had for a thing one creature did to another on purpose, and this was not a technique, and Ith knew it was not, and the knowing had become a weight he carried everywhere. Because if it was not a technique, if it was simply what happened when you stopped hurting a thing and stayed, then his whole people had been doing it wrong, the whole time on purpose, for 1,000 years, and the wrongness was not a policy he could report. It was the floor he stood on, and a young warden cannot report the floor. So Ith did the only thing left to a person who has seen the floor and cannot yet name it. He started quietly on his own shifts, in the dark where no feed watched the watcher, to try it. He went down to the lowest ring, to a small venhound the logs had given up on, and he put his gray hand out to the bars, empty, open, the way he had watched the human do it 100 times. And the venhound flinched from the gray hand out of a lifetime of what gray hands meant, and Ith held still, and waited, and did not pull the hand back. And after a long while the venhound stopped flinching and warily laid the edge of its muzzle against his gray knuckles. And Ith felt it, the thing, come up through his hand from an animal his whole civilization had told him could feel nothing he would recognize, and he understood in that moment that he had already, weeks ago, without a decision, without a speech, changed sides, and that the only question left was what it was going to cost him when the ledger finally footed. He did not have to wait long to find out. They took Fen 2 days later. Jonah never learned exactly how. Maybe a warden walked into the wrong darkroom. Maybe Vesk, being thorough, reconciled the cull ledger against the feeds Ith had missed. Maybe the pup simply cried at the wrong moment. But Jonah came down for his shift, and the cistern door stood open, and the black wet room was empty, except for the chewed strap of feed leather Fen slept with. And every animal on the ring was throwing itself at its door and screaming. And above all of them, from 2 rings down, Bram was making a sound that Jonah had no word for and would hear in his sleep for the rest of his life. He found Vesk on the 2nd level with the pup in a wire carry crate. Fenn was screaming and lunging at the mesh, and when he saw Jonah he went wild, and Jonah's whole body tried to go to him, and the only thing that stopped it was the goad in Vesk's hand, and the 4 wardens ranged behind him, and the simple animal calculation that if he moved wrong now the pup died first. So he stopped. He made his hands open. He made his voice level. "He's mine," Jonah said. "I raised him. He's imprinted. Whatever you want him for, he'll do it better alive and calm than dead or terrified. I can gentle him. You've seen I can. Let me keep him and I'll—" "The whelp," said Vesk, "was logged destroyed under your brand 41 days ago." He tilted the crate so the light fell on the furious little animal inside it. "A false log is falsification of a state instrument's disposition. That is a matter for the adjudicate. So is entering a restricted specimen's enclosure. So is unauthorized alteration of a state instrument's condition." The 4 cold eyes came up. "You have been busy, pen hand. I have written all of it down." And Jonah understood then the shape of the whole thing. He was not going to be flogged. He was going to be tried, because Vesk had realized something the goad master found genuinely fascinating in his bloodless way, that a human could do to a Rendar what 30 years of goads could not, could make the worst animal in the hold lie down and press its head into an open hand, and Vesk, being a servant of the adjudicate to the marrow, had not thought first, "This is a mercy." He had thought first, "This is a capability the state does not control." And an uncontrolled capability in a human was the most dangerous thing the Kasrai order could imagine, and there was only one court that dealt with dangerous humans, and only one sentence it liked to hand down, because the sentence was also a lesson, and the Kasrai loved a lesson more than they loved anything except order. They were going to put Jonah on the culling floor. And Jonah, standing in the second-level dark with his raised hands open and Fenn screaming in the crate and Bram's grief sound coming up through the stone, felt the fear go through him and out the other side and leave behind it something very quiet and very clear. Because if they put him on the floor, they would bring out the instrument to do it. That was the whole grim logic of the place. They would bring out the biggest, worst, most dependable killer in the hold to make the human's death mean something. They were going to send Bram to kill him. They had no idea what they were doing. "All right," Jonah said quietly to Vesk, to the wardens, to the screaming pup, to the great grieving animal 2 rings down that he could not reach. "All right." He lowered his hands. He let them take him. And as the wardens closed around him, he looked once at Fenn in the crate and said, in the low voice all the animals in that place had learned to find in the dark, "Easy, little one. Easy. I'm not going anywhere you can't smell me." He did not know if it was true, but he needed it to be, because it was the only card he had left, and he was already, in the quiet, clear place the fear had left behind, beginning to understand how he might play it. Up on the warden's level, Ith stood at his post and watched them bring the human up in restraints, and watched the human, restrained, turn his head and murmur something to a pup in a crate that made the pup go still, and Ith's gray hands closed slowly on the rail in front of him until the chitin creaked. He had deleted a log to protect this. He had told himself it was nothing, a small mercy, a thing too little to matter. And now the small mercy was walking past him in irons toward the one court that did not do mercy, and Ith understood that he was going to have to decide, soon, and for real, what he was, and the deciding felt like a spike going into a place in him that had never been touched. The adjudicate tried Jonah Veril 3 days later, and it took less than an hour, because the Kasrai did not consider it a difficult case. They held it in the lower chamber of the gray hold, a cold round room of pale stone with the 9 seats of the bench raised along one curved wall, and a single flat stone in the center of the floor where the accused stood. There was no advocate for Jonah, because human labor status did not carry the right of advocacy. There was a recorder, and there were the 9 adjudicators, and there was Vesk, who gave evidence, and there was, standing at the back where a junior warden stands, Ith, who was not required to be there and who had asked to be, and did not know why he had asked, and stood the whole hour with his hands behind his back and his jaw locked. The presiding adjudicator was first adjudicator Osirin, and she was old, and she was not stupid, and that made her worse than Vesk. Jonah watched her from the stone the way he watched a lead cow, the one whose next move the whole herd would follow, and he saw at once that she was the one who mattered. The other 8 would go where she went. She was smaller than the rest, her chitin gone the pale gray of great age, and her 4 eyes had the particular flat patience of a mind that had judged 10,000 cases and been surprised by none of them. And when she looked at Jonah standing on the stone, she looked at him the way you look at a line item, without malice, without interest, with only the faint downward attention of someone confirming a total. Vesk laid it out in his flat, precise voice. The false cull log, the unauthorized entry into a restricted specimens enclosure, repeatedly, over 41 days, verified now against the pen feeds. The unauthorized alteration of a state instrument's medical condition. The concealment and raising of a whelp log destroyed. He read it as a ledger, and it sounded, read that way, exactly as damning as it was, and Osirin nodded along at each item the way you nod at columns that add up. And then Vesk did the thing Jonah had been waiting for, the thing that turned a flogging offense into a culling floor offense, and he did it because he genuinely believed it was the most important part. The specimen-designated instrument, Vesk said, responds to the accused. I have observed it directly. On command from this human, the largest and least tractable war beast in the hold's inventory will cease an aggressive display, submit to physical handling of the ear and skull, and adopt a posture of, he paused, choosing the word with distaste, attachment. I have observed the same effect in lesser degree across the deepest ring. The accused has established, without authorization and without the state's knowledge, a controlling influence over multiple state instruments. I submit that this is the gravest of the charges. A human that can command our beasts is not a labor asset. It is a hazard to the order of the hold. That landed. Jonah watched it land. He watched the 8 lesser adjudicators shift and murmur, and he watched Osirin's flat old eyes come up off the ledger of him, and for the first time actually look. Is it true? She asked him. Her voice was dry and unhurried. It was the first question anyone on the bench had put to him directly, that the beasts obey you. Jonah could have lied. He thought about it for exactly as long as it took to understand that the truth served him better than any lie he could build. No, he said. Osirin waited. They don't obey me, Jonah said. You can't make a Rendar obey. You know that's why you put spikes in them. Obeying's for things that are afraid of you. Bram's not afraid of me. He let that sit a moment in that cold room full of creatures who ran their whole civilization on fear, and he saw Osirin's eyes narrow a fraction, and he went on, quiet and level, the way he'd have talked to the animal itself. I treated a wound your master here let rot for years. I fed a pup you ordered thrown away. That's all I did. I didn't make anything obey me. I just didn't hurt them. And it turns out if you're the only one in the dark who doesn't hurt them, they'll pick you. Any of them, all of them. They'll pick you every time. He looked then not at Osirin but at Vesk. That's not a capability the state doesn't control. That's a capability the state can't do. There's a difference and it's going to cost you and you still don't see it. It was, Ith thought from the back of the room, the bravest and stupidest thing he had ever seen a person do. And he could not tell, watching, whether the human understood that he had just guaranteed the sentence or whether he had done it on purpose, and he would not understand which until the floor, and by then it would be far too late to matter. Osirin was quiet for a long moment. Then she did something Jonah had not expected, which was that she leaned forward, and something almost like life came into the flat old eyes, and she said, You are either a fool or you are the single most dangerous animal that has ever stood on that stone, and I find I cannot tell which, and that itself is intolerable. Do you understand me, human? An order that cannot tell whether a thing is harmless or catastrophic must treat it as catastrophic. You have made yourself unmeasurable. That is why you will die. Not for the log, not for the pup, for the fact that I looked at you and could not put a number on you." "I know," Jonah said, and he did. She passed the sentence in the old formula, without heat, the way she had passed 10,000 others. Death on the culling floor at the coming of the fifth-day crowd, by the state instrument designated for the purpose. She added, because the adjudicate was nothing if not thorough, and because the lesson had to be complete, one further provision, and it was the one that told Jonah she had understood exactly what he was and hated it precisely because she could not measure it. "And because the accused claims the beasts choose him," Ossarin said, "the state will test the claim publicly. The instrument designated for the culling will be the specimen the accused calls Bram. Let the hold see whether the beast chooses him. Let it choose him with its jaws." She sat back. The flat eyes went to the recorder. "So the bench finds, enter it." They took Jonah off the stone. As they turned him, he found Vesk's 4 eyes and held them, and he did not gloat, because he was not a man who gloated and because there was nothing to gloat about yet. But he let the goad master see that he was not afraid, and he watched that land too, and he watched it trouble the old professional in a way the sentence had not. Because Vesk had spent 30 years learning that everything in his world could be made afraid, and here was a soft thing that could not, and a professional hates nothing so much as a fact that does not fit his hands. At the back of the room, Ith made his decision. He did not announce it. He simply turned, while the wardens were busy with the prisoner, and walked out of the chamber and down toward the pens, because he had 3 days, and a plan had started forming in him the moment Ossarin said the beast's name, and it was a plan that would end his career if it went well and his life if it went badly. And for the first time since he had put on the gray, he felt entirely, terribly awake. They kept Jonah, those last 3 days, in a holding cell on the warden's level above the pens, close enough that at night he could hear them. He could hear Bram. 2 levels down and through a world of stone, he could still hear the great animal's grief, the low broken note going on, and every time it came Jonah put his forehead against the cold wall of his cell and answered it under his breath. "Easy, Bram, easy, I'm here," knowing the animal could not hear him, needing to say it anyway. And he could hear closer, sharper, a thin, furious young cry that put a crack straight through him because they had not culled Fen after all. They were keeping the pup. He understood why on the second night, when he heard Vesk's voice in the corridor giving instructions to a warden, and the instructions were about the floor. They were going to use the pup. Vesk had solved the problem the human had handed him. If the beast might choose the human over the killing, and Vesk, being honest with himself in the way of a true professional, had begun to fear that it might, then you removed the choice. You brought the pup to the floor in a crate. You put the pup where the beast could see it and smell it and not reach it. And you made the animal understand, in the language of goads and fear that was the only language the Kasrai had ever been willing to speak to it, that the pup lived or died on the animal's performance. Kill the human and the whelp is spared. Refuse, and the whelp goes first in front of you and then you die anyway. It was, Jonah had to admit, lying in the dark with his forehead on the stone, a very good plan. It used the one thing he'd built, the bond, the love, the whole fragile architecture of trust he'd raised in the dark, and turned it into the lever that would make Bram kill him. It was the kind of plan you could only build if you understood love as a weakness, a handle, a place to put a goad. And that was the flaw in it, the single flaw, and Jonah lay in the dark, and turned that flaw over and over in his hands like a stone, because it was the only thing he had, and he was going to have to be right about it in front of 2,000 Kasrai with no room left to be wrong. On the 3rd night, Warden Ith came to his cell. He came alone, off the feeds in the dead hour, and he stood outside the bars for a long moment saying nothing, a young gray Kasrai with his 4 eyes troubled, and Jonah sat up on the stone shelf and waited, because he had learned that with the Kasrai the silence was often where the real thing lived. "I deleted a log," Ith said finally, quietly, like a confession. The night the whelp was born, I saw the beast touch your hand, and I saw you keep the pup, and I deleted the log so no one would punish it. I have told myself for 40 days that it was nothing." He stopped. "It was not nothing. I am the reason there was no early flag. If I had reported it then, they would have flogged you and taken the pup, and it would have ended small. Instead it grew, and now they will kill you on the floor and use the whelp to do it, and I helped make that by trying to be kind in secret. I wanted you to know that before the 5th day, that I know what I did." Jonah looked at the young warden for a while. "You didn't make this," he said. "Vesk made this. Your bench made this. You just didn't stop a good thing once in the dark. That's not the same." He almost smiled. "Believe me, I'm the world expert on not stopping good things in the dark." Ith's hands worked on the rail. "They are going to bring the whelp to the floor," he said, "to make the beast." "I know." "You know?" Ith stared at him. "How can you? They have built it so that the animal must kill you or watch its child die. There is no move on that board where you live. I have looked at it from every side. There is no move." And Jonah, in the dark of the holding cell, 3 days from the floor, condemned and unarmed and entirely out of options, looked at the one Kasrai in the whole gray hold who had ever tried to help him, and told him the truth, because the truth was the only ally he had left. "There's one," Jonah said, "but I can't make it. Bram has to make it. All I can do is give him something true to reach for when they light up his ear and hope it's louder than the goad." He leaned forward, and his plain, forgettable face was, in that moment, entirely calm. "So I need you to do one thing for me, Warden. Not for me. For him. When they bring the pup out, I need him where Bram can see him and smell him. Not hidden in a crate in the dark. Out, up front, where the old animal can lay eyes on his son and know for certain that he's alive and close." Jonah held the gray warden's 4 eyes. "They think the pup is the goad. Let's find out if they're right about who it's a goad for." Ith was quiet for a long, long moment. Then he said, "That is insane." And Jonah said, "Yeah." And Ith said, "I will do it," and turned and walked back up into the dark, and neither of them slept. And above them the gray hold made ready for the 5th day and the crowd, and 2 levels down a great gray animal grieved in the dark for a son it could not reach and a hand it thought it had lost, and did not know that both of them were already coming to the floor to find it. The 5th day came gray and cold, the way every day came on the world the Kasrai called Vantes, and by the middle of the light the gray hold was full. It was more than full. It was the kind of full that only happened a few times in a warden's career, and Ith, moving through the crowded upper galleries in his gray with his heart going hard, understood for the first time the true size of the thing he had agreed to interfere with. This was not an ordinary culling. Word had gone out on the conquered relays, a human that commanded the state's beasts, to be executed by the greatest of those beasts, publicly, as proof of the natural order, and the conquered had answered. There were envoys in the high tiers, robed delegations from a dozen member worlds, come to see with their own eyes the thing the relays had promised, that the soft, persistent little species from the far lanes, the humans, who kept turning up in the shipping routes and the labor rolls in the physicians' halls, who kept being useful and quiet and unaccountably hard to frighten, would be shown here to be exactly what the Kasrai order had always insisted they were. Prey. A clever prey, a useful prey, but prey, and the proof of it would be the sight of one of them opened on the sand by an animal, while 2,000 watched and a dozen worlds took the lesson home. That was what the Adjudicate had built. Ith saw it now whole. It was not about Jonah at all. Jonah was the occasion. The thing on trial on the culling floor today was the entire question of what a human was, and the Kasrai had rigged the answer, because they always rigged the answer, because an order that runs on fear cannot afford a question it does not already own. He kept moving. He had a crate to reposition, and a very small window, and a plan that depended on no one important looking at a junior warden doing an unremarkable thing. Down in the beast tunnels beneath the floor, Vesk was preparing the instrument. He had been at it since before the light. He had starved the animal for 3 days, which was standard. A hungry instrument worked the crowd better, moved slower, made the death last. He had run the goad on it twice that morning already. Short, controlled bursts, not to hurt it exactly but to seat the fear, to remind the great gray body in its bones that the spike behind its ear was the master of the world and Vesk's hand was the master of the spike. And he had done the new thing, the clever thing, the thing he was privately proud of. He had brought the whelp down into the tunnel in its wire crate and set it where the instrument could smell it. And he had run the goad once hard and then shown the animal, the pup, live and close and unharmed and let the beast make the connection. Pain and then the child safe. He did it 3 times. He was, in his cold, thorough way, teaching the animal a sentence. The whelp lives as long as you do what you are told. Bram took the goad each time and screamed each time, and each time turned his ruined ear away and lowered his great head toward the crate, toward the small, furious gray shape that was his son. And Vesk watched the animal's whole body strain toward the pup and was satisfied. He had found the handle. Everything the human had built, the trust, the gentling, the bond, Vesk had reached in and taken hold of it and turned it into a leash. And it was a better leash than any spike, because it did not have to be seated in the bone. It was seated in the animal's heart, and Vesk did not believe in hearts, but he believed in handles, and this was the best one he had ever held. What Vesk did not know, because he had never in 30 years had a reason to learn it, was the exact thing Jonah had been turning over in the dark for 3 nights. Vesk understood that the animal loved the pup. He had built his whole plan on it. But he understood love the way he understood everything, as a force that could be leveraged, a weight on a scale. He did not understand that love is not a leash, because a leash pulls in only one direction, and love pulls in all of them at once. That an animal made to associate its child's safety with obedience can just as easily, in the right moment, with the right thing to reach for, decide that the way to protect its child is to destroy the hand on the goad. Vesk had built a machine for making Bram kill. He had not once considered that he was also, with every burst of current, teaching the largest predator in the hold to associate the goad, and the crate, and the fear, with the one thing in all the world it had left to lose. He was, in other words, winding a spring and calling it a leash, and standing directly in front of it. Up in the holding cell, they came for Jonah in the last hour. 4 wardens and a 5th carrying the restraints, and behind them, unhurried, first adjudicator Ossarin herself, which was not customary. The presiding adjudicator did not usually come down to collect the condemned. She stood outside his bars while they readied the restraints and looked at him with her flat, old, patient eyes. And Jonah, standing to meet her, understood that she had come because she still could not put a number on him, and it still would not let her rest. "I have presided over 311 cullings," Ossarin said. "I have never come down to look at one of them beforehand. I came to look at you because I have spent 3 days trying to decide whether I am about to correct an error or commit one, and I find I still cannot, and in an hour it will not matter, and I wanted to see your face once more before it stops being a question I can ask." Her head tilted, a small, dry Cassrai gesture. "You are not afraid." 311 times I have watched the condemned in this last hour, and they are afraid, all of them, every species. It is the one thing that does not vary. You are not. Why? Jonah was quiet a moment. Then he said, "Because I'm not the one who has to make the hard choice today." He let the wardens take his wrists. "Bram is, and I've spent 3 nights afraid for him. There wasn't any left over for me." He looked at her, and there was no defiance in it now, just something plain and level and almost gentle, the same thing the animals in the dark had learned to trust. "You keep trying to weigh me, and you can't, and it's eating you. I'll save you the trouble. I'm not heavy. I'm a stock hand from a barge who sat down with a hurt animal, instead of leaving it to rot. That's the whole of me. There's no number missing. The thing you can't measure isn't me." He let them turn him toward the door. "It's what happens when you stop hurting something that everybody else has only ever hurt. You've run this whole place for 1,000 years and you never once tried it, so of course you can't put a number on it. You've never seen it. You're about to." Osarin did not answer, but as they led him out and up the long stair toward the light and the crowd and the sand, she walked beside him for a while, which was also not customary, and she did not look at him, and her old gray hands were folded into her sleeves. And Ith, watching from the gallery mouth as the procession passed, saw that the first adjudicator's hands inside her sleeves were not entirely still. The stair came up into the light at the edge of the culling floor, and the sound hit Jonah like a wall, 2,000 Kasrai and a dozen invite delegations, the vast round tiers of the gray hold rising up and away on every side, the blood lamps burning red at the rails, the sand raked flat and pale and waiting. There was a low iron gate on the far side of the floor, closed, and behind it something moved that was too big to be anything but Bram. And near the front, at the base of the first tier, in the place Ith had moved it to an hour before and talked 3 separate wardens out of questioning, sat a wire crate with a small, furious gray shape flinging itself against the mesh. Fen out up front, where the old animal would see him. Jonah let his eyes rest on the pup for just a moment, and the pup saw him and went wilder, screaming, and Jonah said, too quiet for anyone to hear over the crowd, "Easy, little one. I'm here. Watch your duh. He's going to do something today." Then the wardens walked him out onto the sand, to the mark at the center of the floor, and unlocked his restraints, because the adjudicate wanted him unbound, wanted the crowd to see the human standing free and small and doomed in the open. And then they left him there, and the iron gate on the far side began to grind upward, and the crowd's roar dropped all at once into a vast held silence. And Jonah Verrill stood alone on the pale sand, and watched the worst animal in the gray hold come out into the light to kill him. Bram came out low and fast and wrong. Everything about the way he moved was wrong, and Jonah read it in the first 2 seconds and felt his heart go sideways, because this was not the animal he had gentled in the dark. 3 days of starving, a morning of goats, the crate and the fear and the terrible sentence Vesk had taught him. It had all been poured into the great gray body, and it came out as this: a killing machine wound to its breaking point, plates up, jaws working, the amber eyes blown black and blind with pain and hunger and rage. The goad spike behind the ruined ear caught the bloodlight and gleamed. Somewhere on the rail above, Vesk stood with the master goad in his hands, the remote that fed the spike, and his 4 cold eyes were fixed on the animal, and his thumb was on the switch. Bram did not go straight for Jonah. That was the goad training. An instrument worked the crowd, circled, built the dread. He came out and swung wide and began the slow, terrible orbit, 6 legs eating the sand, pulling the circle tighter with every pass, and the crowd made a low sound of anticipation, and up in her seat first adjudicator Osarin leaned forward, and at the front the pup screamed and flung itself at the mesh, and in the center of the shrinking circle, a young man in a stained work smock stood with his hands open at his sides and did not run. This was the moment the whole galaxy had been brought to see. This was the cold open of the thing, the picture the conquered relays were carrying to a dozen worlds, the beast, the human, the closing circle, the certainty. And a dozen worlds were watching it. That was the part Jonah could not see from the sand and would only understand later, that far out past the gray curve of Vantes, in council halls and barracks and physicians' theaters, and the crowded common rooms of 100 labor ships, sentients of a dozen species had stopped what they were doing to watch the conquered make its point. The Kasrai had sold the broadcast as a lesson, and the lesson was simple and old and had been told 1,000 times before in 1,000 arenas. This is what the strong do to the soft. This is the order of things. This is why you obey. On the far worlds the Kasrai's own kind watched to have their certainty confirmed. On the labor ships the humans watched because they had been made to, screens fixed to the mess walls, and they watched one of their own, a barge hand, a nobody, a face they might have passed in a corridor, stand small and alone on the pale sand while a mountain of armored death drew its circle in tighter. And they watched with the particular silence of people who have been shown, over and over, exactly what they are worth, and are about to be shown it again. Not one of them looked away. That was the thing the Kasrai had never understood about humans, and were about to learn on live relay across the whole Concord, that they do not look away from their own, not even from this, especially not from this. And Jonah, watching the black blind eyes swing past him and away, understood that Vesk had done his work too well. And Jonah, watching the black blind eyes swing past him and away, understood that Vesk had done his work too well. The animal in front of him was not deciding anything. It was too far gone to decide. The goad and the hunger and the fear had driven Bram down below the place where the trust lived, down into the old red animal floor of him, where there was nothing but the spike and the crate and the sentence. And the low, true voice that had reached him in the dark was not going to reach him here. Not over this crowd. Not through this much pain. He needed to bring the animal back up. He had one way to do it, and it was the thing he had told Ith in the dark, and it was going to cost him everything if he was wrong. He had to give Bram something true to reach for, louder than the goad. Jonah did not step back. He took a breath, and instead of retreating from the closing circle, he turned slowly, deliberately, in full view of 2,000 Kasrai and a dozen worlds, and he walked toward the front rail, toward the crate, toward Fenn, 3 steps, 4, putting himself between the shrinking orbit of the beast and the small, screaming gray shape of its son. And he crouched down in the sand beside the crate, in the open, with the killer at his back, and he put his fingers through the mesh, and Fenn seized them and stopped screaming and pressed the whole small, trembling weight of himself against the human's hand. And Bram, mid-orbit, mid-fury, black-eyed and blind, caught the scent. It came up through the red. That was the only way the animal could have understood it, if it understood anything in words, which it did not. It understood in older things than words, in weights and heats and scents laid down in the deep floor of the brain where the goad had never reached. And down in that deep floor, under the fury and the hunger and the 3 days of pain, there were exactly 2 scents that meant more to the great gray animal than its own life, and they had just braided together in the air in front of it, close, and the braid pulled on something the goad could not override. The pup, his pup, alive, warm, close, throwing that scent that had printed into him the night in the pens when the soft hand held his son up to the bars, and under it, around it, in it, the other one. The salve and the sweat and the low, steady voice, the hand that had come to the ruined ear in the dark and made the fire stop, the only hand in the animal's entire long life of goads that had ever come toward the wound without bringing more pain. Both of them, together, in front of it. And the small screaming shape had gone quiet, and it had gone quiet because the soft hand was touching it, and the deep floor of the animal's brain put those facts together the way it had put together every true thing it had ever learned, slowly and totally, and permanently. The circle broke, Bram stopped. 2,000 Kasrai saw the instrument stop mid-orbit 6 paces from the crouched human's back, and did not understand it, and made a low, confused sound. On the rail, Vesk's 4 eyes narrowed, and his thumb moved on the switch. Jonah felt the current before he heard the scream. He felt it because Bram's whole body slammed the sand as the goad lit the spike behind the ruined ear, the healed nerve going up all at once in white fire, and the animal shrieked and convulsed, and the black came flooding back into the amber eyes, the goad hauling him back down off the true thing toward the red. Vesk held the switch. He held it and watched the animal thrash and knew he was winning, because this was the whole of his craft. This was 30 years of certainty, that no love in any animal could outpull a spike in the bone, that the goad was the master of the world. And on the sand, in the middle of the beast's agony, the human stood up. Jonah stood up slow in the open, his back to the convulsing animal, and he did not flinch from the screaming or the crowd or the switch. He turned. He faced Bram. And he began to walk toward him, toward the thrashing, black-eyed, goad-maddened killer, unarmed, unhurried, his hands open at his sides. And as he walked, he began to talk, low and even, the voice he had used in the dark. And this time he pitched it not to carry to the crowd but to carry to the one animal, under the crowd, under the current, down into the deep floor where the true things lived. "Easy," Jonah said, walking. "Easy, Bram, I know it hurts. It's the ear, I know it's just the ear, it's not you." Another step. The animal thrashed and the goad sang and the crowd roared and the young man walked into all of it as if it were only weather. "You're not the thing they made you. You never were. I've had my hands on the real you in the dark and it's not this. Easy now. Come up out of it. Come back up to me." Another step. He was close now, too close, inside the reach of the jaws, and Vesk saw it and pressed the switch to its stop and held it there. And Bram screamed and half rose, and his great head swung around blind and black, and his jaws opened over the human, and 2,000 Kasrai drew one breath. And Jonah reached up into the open jaws, past the teeth as long as his fingers, and laid his open hand against the torn and ruined ear. He did not grab, he did not flinch. He laid the flat of his hand, gentle as he had laid it that first night in the pens, against the base of the wounded ear where the fire was, on the good skin around the horror of the spike, and he held it there in the animal's agony, and he said, so quiet that only the beast could have heard it, "I've got you. He's done. It's done. I've got you, Bram. Easy." And the animal came up out of the red. Everyone in the gray hold saw it happen, and not one of them could have said how. They saw the instrument mid-strike, jaws open over the human, the goad burning full through its spike, and they saw it stop. They saw the black flood back out of the amber eyes. They saw the great jaws, which had been closing, go still with the human's arm between them, and then open wider, careful, and withdraw, lifting the teeth away from the soft body they had been about to close on. They saw the enormous plated head, which had been rearing to kill, turn and lower and press, slow, deliberate, unmistakable, into the human's chest, into the cup of the hand on its ear, the whole vast weight of it settling down and down, until the killer of 300 sentience was kneeling on the pale sand of the culling floor with its head bowed into the arms of the boy it had been brought out to murder. Vesk held the switch at its stop. The goad was still firing. The spike was still burning. And the animal knelt in the fire and did not move, because the thing it had found to reach for was louder than the goad, was louder than anything the Kasrai had ever had to offer it, and it had reached it, and it was not going to let it go for all the current in the world. The gray hold went utterly silent. It was a silence Ith would remember to the end of his life. 2,000 Kasrai and a dozen world's envoys, come to watch a human proven prey, staring down at a human standing in the wreck of that certainty with the worst animal in the conquered bowed into his arms, and not one of them making a sound, because there was no sound that fit. The blood lamps burned. The sand lay pale. And in the center of it, the young man in the stained smock stood with his hand on a monster's ruined ear and his forehead bowed down to touch the great gray skull, and his lips were moving, and no one could hear what he was saying, and everyone understood that it did not matter, because the animal could, and that was the whole of the thing they had all been brought here, against the adjudicate's every intention, to see. Up in the high seat, first adjudicator Ossarin sat very still, and she looked down at the human she could not measure, and she understood at last what the missing number was, and it was not a quantity at all. It was a category the Kasrai order did not possess. She had built her whole long life on the proposition that everything could be made to obey through fear, that fear was the floor under all order, and she had just watched a soft, unarmed animal walk into full current and reach past the teeth and prove, in front of a dozen worlds she governed in the conquered's name, that there was a thing that ran deeper than fear and answered to none of her instruments, and that the humans had it, and that her people did not, and had never even thought to look for it. Because you cannot find a thing you have spent 1,000 years teaching yourself does not exist. She had not corrected an error today. She had committed one in front of everyone, and it was the largest of her life, and it was still unfolding on the sand below her, and it was not finished. Because on the rail, Vesk had finally taken his thumb off the switch. He did it because the goad had failed, and a professional does not waste a discharge on a failed application, and he needed to think. He stood with the master goad in his hands and his 4 cold eyes fixed on the impossible thing on the sand. And for the first time in 30 years, the goad master did not know what to do with an animal, and it frightened him. And Vesk did not handle fear the way the humans did. He handled it the way his whole order handled it. He reached for more force. He had the pup. He still had the pup. The crate sat at the base of the first tier where the human had crouched by it, and the whelp was in it, and the whelp was the handle, the real handle, the one seated in the animal's heart. Vesk had built his whole plan on it, and the plan had gone wrong, but the handle was still there, still his, and a professional does not abandon a working handle because the first pull failed. He turned from the rail and he called down to the 2 wardens stationed by the crate, in his flat, cold, carrying voice, and he gave the order he had prepared 3 days before as the second half of the sentence he had taught the beast in the tunnels. And it was the order that would either finish the culling or, though Vesk could not have conceived of it, finish the gray hold. "Kill the whelp," Vesk said, "now where the instrument can see it. Then goad it onto the human while it grieves." And down on the sand, the great gray head came up off Jonah's chest, and the amber eyes, clear now, clear and awake and entirely present, turned toward the crate at the base of the tier, toward the small gray shape of his son, toward the 2 wardens who had just put their hands on the mesh. And Jonah, feeling the animal go rigid under his hand, feeling the whole vast body gather, understood that Vesk had just at last made the one mistake that could not be taken back. He had built a spring and called it a leash, and he had just cut it loose. Jonah's hand was still on the ear. That was the only thing that saved the 2 wardens' lives, and it saved them by less than a breath. Because the instant Vesk gave the order, the whole vast body of Bram surged up off the sand toward the crate, and a rendar at full extension covers ground the way a landslide covers ground, and the wardens by the crate had time to do exactly nothing before the shadow of him fell over them. But Jonah's hand was on the ear, and Jonah's voice was already moving, low and hard and fast, cutting under the roar that had just broken loose in the tears. "Bram, the pup, get the pup. Leave them, go around them, the pup, Bram, get your son." And the great animal mid-lunge heard it, not the words. The animal did not have the words. But it had spent 41 nights learning the shape of that voice in the dark, learning that the voice meant true things, and the voice was saying something now with the whole of its urgency bent toward the crate and not toward the 2 gray shapes cowering in front of it, and Bram's blind fury bent with it. He did not stop. Nothing was going to stop him, but he turned the strike. The 2 wardens, who had drawn back expecting to die, felt the wind of him pass and slam into the tier wall beside them, and then Bram's jaws were on the crate, not crushing, careful, the exact measured softness Jonah had felt that first night when the killer took meat from his fingers, and the wire mesh peeled open like paper, and Fen scrambled out and up the great gray foreleg and vanished into the plating of his father's shoulder and was safe. The gray hold came apart. It came apart all at once in every tier, and Ith moving now, already moving, because he had known since the dark of the holding cell that it would come to this, and had spent the last 3 days making one preparation he had told no one, not even the human. Ith saw it come apart, and understood that the thing he had set in motion could not now be stopped, and found that he did not want to stop it. The envoys in the high tiers were on their feet. The Kasrai crowd was surging back from the rails. And down on the floor the impossible had finished happening and turned into something the adjudicate had no procedure for at all. The instrument was loose, ungoaded, unowned, standing over the human it had been sent to kill with its rescued son on its shoulder, and its clear amber eyes swinging up at last toward the rail where the goad master stood. Bram looked at Vesk. 30 years the goad master had run the current into that animal. 30 years he had been the hand behind the spike, the master of the fire in the ear, the cold certainty at the top of the rail. And he had been, in all that time, the single most constant source of pain in the animal's entire life, and the animal had never once been able to reach him, because the goad had always been faster, and now the goad lay useless in Vesk's hands, its master switch firing into a spike that the animal had simply decided, with the whole force of the thing that ran deeper than fear, to stop obeying. Bram looked up the rail at Vesk with his son on his shoulder and his clear eyes cold, and he came for him. He came up the tier wall. A Rendar can climb. No one in the crowd had ever seen the instrument do it, because the instrument had never in its life had a reason to, and the sight of that vast gray body coming up the sheer stone toward the adjudicate rail sent the whole front tier into a screaming rout. Vesk backed away from the rail. He was still firing the goad. Jonah could see him doing it, the thumb jammed down on the dead switch, the professional certainty of 30 years still insisting that the current was the master of the world even as the master of the world climbed the wall toward his throat. And it was, Jonah thought, the truest picture of the whole Kasrai order he would ever see. A cold old hand jamming down a switch that no longer connected to anything, because the alternative was admitting the switch had never been the thing that held the world together at all. Bram came over the rail, the envoy's tier emptied around him. And Vesk, back to the wall with the dead goad in his hands and 30 years of certainty draining out of his 4 cold eyes, did at last the thing he had spent his whole life making other creatures do. He showed fear. And the animal that had learned fear at his hands, and had learned 3 days ago to hate the crate and the goad and everything they meant with the whole of its heart, lowered its great head and opened its jaws over the goad master and stopped. It stopped because of the voice. Bram, Jonah had not moved from the sand. He did not shout it. He never shouted. The whole hold had learned in the last 10 minutes that the human never shouted and had learned to go silent to hear him, and they went silent now, 2,000 of them straining down to catch a word pitched for one animal. Bram, leave him. A breath. The great jaws hung open over the goad master, trembling with the want of it. You don't need him. Look at me. Fenn's safe. You're free. You don't have to be the thing he made. Leave him for me. Come down. Come down to your boy and me, and leave him. And the animal, jaws open over 30 years of pain, held and shook and wanted and held. And then it closed its jaws on nothing, and lifted its head off the cowering goad master, and turned, and went back down the wall to the sand, to the human, to the small gray pup that came flowing down off its shoulder and across the floor and up Jonah's leg, and along his shoulders, churring, home. Vesk was left standing against the wall, alive, untouched, and finished. That was the thing the crowd understood in the vast strange silence after, and it was worse for Vesk than any death the floor had ever staged. The goad master had not been killed. He had been spared, in front of 2,000 Kasrai and a dozen worlds, by the word of the human he had condemned, spared as a mercy, the way you spare a thing that no longer matters, the way Jonah spared everything. And the sparing said, more loudly than any killing could have, that the goad master and his goad and his 30 years of certainty had been weighed in the last 10 minutes and found to be nothing. He stood against the wall with the dead rod in his hands and his authority gone out of him like water, and no one looked at him with fear anymore. And for a creature who had built his entire self on being feared, it was the end of him, and everyone in the hold knew it, and so did he. But the gray hold was not done coming apart, because Ith had made a preparation, and it was about to arrive. Down in the pens beneath the floor, 3 levels of iron cells full of the conquered's beasts had been listening for 10 minutes to a thing come up through the stone that none of them had ever heard before, the sound of the great gray animal that ruled the deepest ring, the instrument, the oldest and worst of them, not screaming under the goad but calling, one clear ungoaded note after another, the sound of a Rendar that had found the soft hand and was not afraid. And every beast in the pens had been orienting on that sound the way iron orients on a stone, throwing itself at its door, and the doors of the gray hold's pens were old, and they were controlled from a warden station, and at that station, 10 minutes ago, a junior warden named Ith had entered his lawful code, and with one gray finger, opened every one of them. He had told himself doing it that he did not know if it would matter. That was a lie, the same lie he had told himself deleting the log. He knew exactly what it would do. He had spent 40 days watching the feeds. He knew that if the beasts of the gray hold were ever loosed while the soft hand stood on the floor, there was only one place in the universe they would go. They came up out of the beast tunnels into the light like a gray flood. There were more of them than anyone in the tiers had ever seen at once, because no one ever saw them at once. The gray hold kept its beasts in the dark, one to a cell, precisely so that no Kasrai would ever have to reckon with the sum of them. Now the sum of them came boiling up the floor gates, and the tunnel mouths and the maintenance stairs, 40 and 50 and more. Every apex predator the conquered had bred or captured or condemned. The venhounds low and whistling, the half-broken war beasts, the scarred thing 3 cells down that had taken meat from Jonah's fingers, the whole terrible inventory of the adjudicates power loose at once in the open air with 2,000 Kasrai above them. And the crowd's roar tore up into the high animal register of true panic, and the tears surged for the exits, and the gray hold, which had been built 1,000 years ago to stage the absolute certainty of Kasrai order, became in the space of 10 heartbeats a stone bowl full of screaming and the promise of slaughter. And then the slaughter did not come. That was the thing. That was the thing Ith had gambled on, and the thing Ossarin would spend the rest of her life failing to fully understand, and the thing the dozen Enva worlds would carry home and argue over for a generation. The beasts came up out of the dark into a hold pact with the species that had goaded and caged and starved them for their whole lives, with every reason and every opportunity to open that entire population throat by throat. And they did not. They came up the tunnels and out onto the sand, and they oriented, all of them, on the one point of gentleness in the whole vast stone bowl, the way they had oriented on him every night in the dark, and they went to him. They flowed across the floor, and they gathered around the young man in the stained smock, and they arranged themselves. No one told them to. Jonah stood on the sand with Fen along his shoulders and his hand on Bram's lowered head and watched 50 apex predators come to him and settle into a shape, and the shape was not a mob. It was a formation. Bram took the center, the great gray bulk of him at Jonah's back. The war beasts spread to the flanks. The venhounds went low and forward, a screening line along the sand. The whole loose flood of them resolved, in the space of a few breaths, into a disciplined half-circle with the human at its heart, every animal facing outward, every eye up on the tiers, a wall of the conquered's own apex predators standing between the crowd and the boy. And it was not a thing anyone had trained, because no one had ever imagined it, because it had never before in the history of the gray hold been safe to be gentle to these animals, and so no one had ever learned what gentleness, returned by 50 of them at once, would build. It built an army. It built it in 10 heartbeats, out of love, and it set it around one unarmed stockhand from a barge, and it turned every face in the conquered's highest court up toward him to wait and see what the human would do with it. Because that was the new fact, and it had inverted so completely and so fast that half the crowd had not caught up to it. The power in the gray hold no longer sat on the high bench. It stood on the sand, small and plain and straw-haired, with its hand on a monster's ear. 50 apex predators waited on his word. 2,000 Kasrai and a dozen world's envoys were, at that moment, alive entirely because a young man they had condemned to death had not yet said otherwise. Every rail in the hold had a Kasrai clinging to it staring down at the human, and in every one of those faces was the same thing, the thing the whole niche of their fear had never prepared them to feel. They were looking at a predator at last, a real one, the apex of the apex, and it did not look like them, and it did not roar, and it was holding their lives in an open hand and had not decided yet what to do. Jonah looked up at all of them, and he did the thing he always did. He kept his voice low and level, and he did not gloat, because there was nothing in him that gloated, and because 2,000 frightened people and 50 coiled predators were the exact worst audience in the galaxy to raise your voice in front of. "Nobody move fast," he said. It carried in the silence the way his voice always carried, because they had all learned to go still to hear it. Not you up there. Not you at the gates. These animals aren't going to hurt anybody unless somebody makes them, and the only one in this room who's ever made them do anything is standing against that wall with a dead stick in his hands, and he's done. So everybody just be still. Be still, and let me talk to the one who has to make the next choice, and this ends with everybody walking home." He let that settle. Then he lifted his plain, forgettable face to the high seat, to the small, pale, ancient shape sitting motionless in the middle of the emptying bench, the one Casrai in the whole hold who had not fled, and he said, "First adjudicator, you wanted a number for me. Come down and I'll give you one." First adjudicator, Oseran sat alone on the high bench above a stone bowl full of loosed predators and did not flee. And it was the single bravest thing anyone in the gray hold did that day, and the only one that mattered as much as what the human had done, because it was the thing that gave the day a way to end that was not a massacre. She rose. Around her the last of the bench was scrambling for the exits, adjudicators 1,000 years into the certainty of their order clawing over one another to be away from the sand, and Oseran stood alone among the abandoned seats, old and pale and unhurried, and she looked down the long drop at the human and his impossible army, and then she walked to the head of the adjudicate stair, and she began, without an escort, without a guard, without a goad, to come down onto the floor. Ith met her at the base of the stair. He had come out onto the floor himself by then. He no longer had any career left to protect, and he had discovered somewhere in the last 10 minutes that he did not care, and he stood at the bottom of the stair in his junior gray and said to the first adjudicator quietly, "It was me. The doors. I opened the pens. Whatever comes of this, it was my code and my choice, not his." Oseran looked at the young warden for a moment with her flat old eyes. "I know it was you," she said. "There is no one else in this hold with the imagination to do something so catastrophic and so correct." And she went past him, out onto the sand alone, toward the human and the wall of beasts, and the venhounds along the forward line rose and whistled, and Bram's great head came up, and Jonah said, "Easy. Easy, let her come. She's the one who can stop the killing. Let her come to me." And the line settled, and the old adjudicator walked through a gap in a wall of apex predators that opened for her because a stock hand said it should, and stopped in front of Jonah on the pale sand, and the two of them stood there in the eye of it, and the whole conquered watched. "You said you would give me a number," Oseran said. "I lied," said Jonah. "There isn't one. That's the number. That's what you couldn't measure." He shifted Fenn's weight on his shoulders, an ordinary small motion, a man settling a restless animal, and 50 predators tracked it and were still. "You built everything you've got on being able to weigh a thing and know how much fear it takes to hold it. And you can't weigh this because it's not made of fear. It's the opposite thing. It's what you get when you stop hurting something and just stay. It doesn't have a number because it doesn't run on the scale you built. That's not me being special, first adjudicator. Any human in your pens would have done what I did. We're not stronger than you. We're not smarter. We just never learned to think fear was the floor, so we went looking under it. And this," he tipped his head at the wall of beasts, at Bram, at the pup on his shoulders, at 50 of the Concord's own monsters standing in formation for a condemned barge hand. "This is what's under it. This is what you've been standing on top of for 1,000 years and never once dug down to find." Oseran was silent. She had lived 1,100 years and presided over 311 cullings, and she had never, in all of it, been handed a fact she could not fit into the order she served. And she was holding one now, and Jonah watched the old adjudicator look at it, and to her enormous and unexpected credit, not look away. And it was that moment, the moment the first adjudicator stood on the sand and let herself see the thing, the one moment in the whole day when the gray hold might have turned toward something other than blood, that Vesk chose to end. He had not been idle against his wall. A professional is never idle. While the human talked and the old fool of an adjudicator walked out onto the sand to be devoured, Vesk had done the one thing his 30 years had left him. which was to reach the wall panel behind him, the emergency containment station that every floorside gold master carried the code to. The system the Adjudicate had built for exactly this contingency, and never once had cause to use. The hold-wide purge. Every cell, every tunnel, every stretch of open floor in the gray hold was threaded with the deep master conduit that fed the gold spikes, and the purge sent full lethal current through every spike in the building at once. A fail-safe, a last resort, the switch you threw when the beasts got loose, and you had decided to lose the entire inventory rather than let one animal reach the tiers. It would kill every Rendar and Ven Hound and War Beast in the hold in a single instant, spikes cooking every nerve root at once, and it would kill them where they stood, in formation, around the human. Vesk entered the code with his cold, steady professional hands, and he did not hesitate, because he had decided that if the world would not run on fear any more then, he would burn the world down to the last certainty he had, and he pressed the master switch that fed lethal current to every spike in the gray hold, and he felt, for one last instant, the old satisfaction of the man who still holds the switch. Nothing happened. Nothing happened, and Vesk stared at the dead panel, and the reason nothing happened was standing at the base of the Adjudicate stair in a junior warden's gray with his 4 eyes on the gold master. Because Ith had spent 3 days making one preparation he had told no one, and it had not been the pens. "I cut the master conduit this morning," Ith said. His voice shook, but the words did not. "Before the light. I went down into the deep gallery and I cut the purge feed and I spliced it dead because I knew if it came to this you would reach for it, because it is the only move your kind has ever had, the move where you lose everything rather than admit the floor was never fear. So I took it away from you. There is no purge, Vesk. There is no current in any spike in this hold. There hasn't been since dawn." He drew a breath. "The animals down there haven't been held by the goats for hours. They stayed in their cells this whole time for no reason, but that they had nowhere they wanted to go until he called." Vesk pressed the dead switch again, and again. The oldest goad master in the gray hold stood against the wall jamming his thumb into a panel that no longer connected to anything, exactly as he had jammed the master goad, and it was the same picture drawn twice, and this time the whole conquered saw it and understood it. A servant of fear pressing a dead switch, over and over, unable to conceive of a world the switch did not rule. Bram turned his great head and looked at the goad master one more time. "No," Jonah said quietly, "not him. He's already gone, Bram, look at him. There's nothing left to take." And the great animal looked at Vesk pressing his dead switch, and something in the amber eyes that was older and wiser than hate seemed to weigh the shell of the thing against the wall and find it not worth the walking over. And Bram turned his head away, and left the goad master standing alive and forgotten with his dead switch. And that was the end of Vesk, who lived another 40 years in the reclamation records of the gray hold, and was never once in any of them feared by anything again. It should have ended there. It did not end there because the gray hold was not a room, it was the seat of a power, and powers do not fall in an afternoon, and the conquered had heard. The relays had carried all of it. Every world that had tuned in to watch a human-proven prey had instead watched the instrument bow, watched the pens empty, watched 50 apex predators form a wall around a barge hand, and the first adjudicator walk out alone onto the sand to treat with him. And somewhere out past the gray curve of Vantes, a conquered security cohort had been listening to the panic on the hold's channels and had done what security cohorts do, which is decide that order must be restored and reach for the tool they understood. And now, over the roar and the panic and the strange held silence of the floor, came a new sound, a deep mechanical descending howl, and Jonah looked up past the emptying tiers to the high vault of the hold where the great ceremonial doors stood, and saw them grinding open, and saw what was coming through. A conquered containment cohort, 300 of them, in the heavy sealed armor the Kasrai used when they had decided a situation was past negotiation. Mag lances, containment guns, the wide-bore weapons built to put down exactly the kind of loosed apex predator that was standing in formation on the floor below. They came in through the high doors and down the emptied tiers in a disciplined pouring line, and at their head came a figure in the deep red of a conquered marshal, and the marshal's amplified voice rolled down over the gray hold flat and vast and certain. By authority of the conquered, this hold is under containment. All specimens will be put down. The human anomaly will be secured for study. Cohort advanced to firing stations. And the whole thing tilted again, because the 50 predators around Jonah felt the threat come down the tiers and rose to meet it, and 300 containment guns came up to answer them. And the young man on the sand understood that he had perhaps 4 seconds before the gray hold became the massacre it had been trying to become all day. Only now the massacre would run in every direction at once, the beasts into the cohort. The cohort into the beasts, and the human and the old adjudicator standing unarmed between them. And no low true voice in any language was going to be fast enough to stop 300 trigger fingers and 50 sets of jaws from finding each other across 40 feet of open sand. 4 seconds. Jonah did the only thing there was time to do. He did not raise his hands. He did not shout. He turned his back on 300 leveled containment guns, put his back to them, deliberately, in full view of the marshal and the cohort and the dozen watching worlds. And he faced his animals, and he stepped in front of them between the guns and the beasts, and he put his open hand flat on Bram's lowered skull. And he said into the 4 seconds, loud enough this time, loud enough for the relays and the marshal and the whole conquered to hear. If you fire through me first. The 4 seconds stretched and did not break. They did not break because 300 containment guns were pointed at a scene that no soldier in the cohort had been briefed for. A soldier can fire on a loose beast. That is what the containment cohort is for, and every one of them had come down the tiers ready to do exactly that. But the beasts were not charging. The beasts were standing in a disciplined wall behind an unarmed human who had turned his back on the guns to shield them, and standing beside that human, on the open sand, in the pale robes of her office, was the first adjudicator of the gray hold, who had not moved. And 300 fingers hovered on 300 triggers and could not find, in all their training, the order that covered a target that looked like that. You do not, if you are a conquered soldier raised on the certainty of the order, cut down your own first adjudicator to get at a stock hand and his animals. The picture would not resolve into a thing they were allowed to shoot. Up at the head of the cohort, the marshal in conquered red saw the same picture, and did the calculation faster and colder than any soldier under him, and reached a different place, because a marshal's training runs deeper than a soldier's. The marshal's training said, the human anomaly has now demonstrated the capacity to command the conquered's beasts and to use the first adjudicator's body as a shield. The anomaly is more dangerous than the beasts. Acceptable losses in securing it include the adjudicator. The marshal drew breath to give the order that a soldier could not give himself, the order that made the target legal, and Jonah saw it coming the way he saw everything coming, in the set of the body before the act, and knew that this was the edge of it. This was the 4 seconds running out, and that his back and his open hand and his one true voice were not going to be enough against a marshal who had already done the math. It was Ossarin who ended it. She did not raise her voice. She had never in 1100 years needed to. She simply turned on the sand to face the cohort and the marshal and the dozen worlds relays, and she spoke in the flat, dry, carrying tone of the highest judicial authority in the gray hold, and she said the thing that no one, not Jonah, not Ith, not the marshal, not a single soul in the conquered, had expected the first adjudicator to say. Stand down, Ossarin said. There is no anomaly here. There is no containment. The bench is in session, and I am the bench, and I am ruling. The marshal's amplified voice came back flat and hard. First adjudicator, with respect, the hold is compromised, the specimens are loose, and the human has demonstrated. The human, said Oseran, has demonstrated a fact. And I have spent my entire life administering an order built on the proposition that all facts can be weighed and held. If that proposition is true, then this fact can be ruled upon here, on the record, in front of the conquered, and does not require 300 guns. And if that proposition is false, she paused, and the whole hold heard the old adjudicator's voice do something it had not done in the memory of anyone present. It wavered, a single hair's breadth, and steadied. If that proposition is false, then 300 guns will not make it true, and we will have murdered our own first adjudicator and a hold full of beasts on live relay to prove to a dozen worlds that we would rather kill than learn. Stand your cohort down, Marshal. That is a ruling from the bench. Disobey it and you may explain to the conquered why you fired on a sitting adjudicator who was, at the time, entirely unharmed and entirely in command of the situation. Stand down. The 4 seconds ended. The marshal, caught in the one vice a conquered officer cannot fight his way out of, a lawful order from an authority he could not lawfully ignore, given on a relay a dozen worlds were watching, held for one long moment, and then lifted a red gauntleted hand, and the 300 containment guns came down. Jonah let out a breath he had been holding for what felt like his whole life. He did not turn around to face the cohort. He kept his back to them and his hand on Bram's skull, because turning around would have looked like triumph, and there was still 50 feet of terror in every direction that one wrong-looking motion could set off. He just stood and breathed, and under his hand the great gray animal breathed with him, and on his shoulders the pup shifted and settled, and behind him the wall of predators, feeling the pressure ease, let their plates come down by a fraction. That was well done, he said low to Oseran, not looking at her. Thank you. Do not thank me, said Oseran. I have not done you a kindness. I have done my office a necessity. There is a difference, and it matters, and you of all creatures should understand it. But she said it without heat, and she did not step away from him, and she stood on the sand at the side of the human and his beasts with her back also, now, half turned to the cohort, and the picture that the relays carried out to a dozen worlds in that moment was a picture the conquered would not be able to unsee for 100 years. The first adjudicator of the gray hold, standing shoulder to shoulder with a human and a wall of the conquered's own apex predators, against a containment cohort of her own people. Whatever else happened, that picture had happened on the record, and the order that ran on fear had a crack in it now that ran all the way to the top, and everyone who had watched knew it. So, Oseran said after a while quietly only to him, you told me there was no number. I am inclined now to believe you, which leaves me a difficulty human that is larger than you and larger than this hold. Because if fear is not the floor, if there is a thing beneath it that holds better than fear ever held, and your kind has it and mine does not, then everything I have administered for 1100 years is not order at all. It is only fear wearing order's robes. And I am too old to unlearn it and too honest, now that I have seen this, to keep pretending I did not. She looked up at him with the flat old patient eyes, and there was something in them that had not been there on the high bench, something that might in a younger creature have been grief, and might in her have been the beginning of the only kind of courage her people had never been taught. What am I to do with what you have shown me? Tell me plainly. You have upended my world on live relay. What do you want? And Jonah Verrill, stock hand, condemned, standing on the culling floor with a monster's ear under one hand and its child on his shoulders and 50 predators at his back and a dozen worlds watching, thought about it, and gave her a plain answer, because plain answers were the only kind he had. I want to walk out of here, he said. With them, all of them, the ones from the pens, everyone, they're mine now whether anybody likes it or not. You saw them choose. I want the pens closed, not moved, not renamed. Closed. I want the spikes out of every animal that can survive having them out, and I'll do the pulling myself. I know how, I've done it. I want the humans in your reclamation yards and your physicians' halls to stop being labor status and start being people, because you've just found out on live relay exactly how badly you've misjudged what a human is, and it's going to be a great deal cheaper for you to fix that now in front of everyone than to have it explained to you again by 50 animals in a room you can't lock. He paused. And that's all. I don't want your hold. I don't want your bench. I'm a barge hand. I want to take my animals and go somewhere with sky and never see a goat again. Give me that, and this ends today, and the last thing the conquered sees on the relay is a first adjudicator who was wise enough to stop, instead of one who was too proud to. That's the trade. It's a good one. Take it. Oseran looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, the oldest judicial authority in the gray hold inclined her ancient head, a small motion, dry and deliberate, the gesture her people used to acknowledge a ruling they could not overturn. And she turned to face the relays and the cohort and the emptied tiers full of Kasrai peering back down now that the guns were down. And she raised her voice one last time to enter it on the record where a dozen worlds could hear. Let it be entered, Oseran said, that the bench finds the sentence against the human Jonah Veril to be void, and the charge of commanding the state's beasts to be not a crime but a truth, and a truth the state was wrong to fear. Let it be entered that the beast pens of the gray hold are closed by ruling of the bench, this day, and their inventory remanded to the custody of the human, who has demonstrated a better claim to it than the state ever held. Let it be entered, and here the old voice paused and steadied, and went on into the thing that would outlast all the rest, the thing the conquered would spend a generation arguing over and never quite escape. Let it be entered that on this day the gray hold learned that there is a thing that runs deeper than fear, and that it did not have it, and that the humans did, and that the wise response to such a discovery is not the gun. It is the open hand. It took the rest of the day for the gray hold to empty, and it emptied slowly, the way a held breath goes out, and no one who was there ever forgot the strangeness of it, 2,000 Kasrai, and a dozen worlds' delegations filing out of a stone bowl they had come to as a place of certainty, past a floor where 50 apex predators lay easy in the sand around a barge hand who was, one at a time, doing the thing he had asked for. Jonah started with Bram. He did it right there on the floor, in front of everyone who had not yet left, because the animal would not be still for it anywhere he could not also be seen, and because Jonah had learned in one long day that the Kasrai needed to watch the thing done as badly as the beast needed it done. He knelt at the great gray skull with the salve he'd asked Ith to bring up from the physician's hall, and the fine drivers and the clamp, and he put his hand on the torn ear the way he had that first night in the dark, and he said, "All right. Last time anybody's ever going to touch this the wrong way. Then never again. Easy, Bram, I've got you." Pulling a goad spike is worse than driving one, because a driven spike goes into healthy flesh, and a pulled one comes out of a life's worth of scar, and the animal has to hold still through the one thing every nerve in it screams to fight. Bram held still. He held still with his son pressed against Jonah's back and the whole conquered watching, and he made the low questioning note, the one-word language, up at the end, over and over, while the human worked the black iron loose from the bone it had lived in for 30 years, and when it came free at last, the whole hand length of it, slick and terrible, and Jonah packed the wound and pressed the good ear flat and said, There. It's out. It's over, Bram. It's out for good." The great animal turned its head and pressed its skull into the human's chest and shook, the way it had that first night, and this time the shaking was not fear leaving. It was something the Kasrai had no word for, and the closest word any of them had was one they had spent 1,000 years refusing to feel in the presence of a beast, and it was grief, and it was joy, and it was the two of them together, which is the thing a body does when a pain it had stopped believing would ever end simply ends. Jonah held the spike up for a moment, and then he dropped it in the sand, and he did not look at it again. That was the moment, the pen hands would say afterward, that the phrase started, though no human coined it, and Jonah would have laughed at the idea of coining anything. It started with the Kasrai, because the Kasrai codified everything, and because they had just watched on live relay, a gesture they could not explain and could not forget. A human reaching up, past the teeth, into the fire, to lay an open hand on a monster's ruined ear, and the monster coming up out of its madness to meet it. A young clerk in the emptying tiers said at first, half to himself, trying to name the thing he had seen, the ones the beasts choose, the ones who touch the ear. And by the time the relays had carried the day out to the last world of the conquered, it had a shape, and the shape was a phrase, capitalized the way the Casri capitalized their doctrines, solemn the way they made everything solemn. The ear touched. It came to mean, in the years after, a specific and dangerous thing, a human, or later others who learned it from the humans, in whose presence the apex predators of the conquered would not stay goaded. The adjudicate tried for a while to keep a registry of them. They gave it up. You cannot registry a thing that is only ever discovered in the dark, by someone sitting down with a hurt animal instead of leaving it to rot. And the Casri learned that too, slowly, the way they learned everything, and it changed them slowly, the way true things do. But that was later. On the floor, as the light failed, there was only the work. Jonah pulled spikes until his hands cramped, and Ith took over the salve and the packing under his direction. And a strange thing happened as they worked, which was that Ith stopped being a warden. He did not announce it. He simply knelt in the sand beside the human and put his own gray hands to the animals, carefully, the way he was shown. And the first war beast he touched flinched from the gray hands out of a lifetime of what gray hands had meant. And then, feeling the hands come gentle, held still, and let the young Casri help. And Ith made a sound Jonah had not heard a Casri make, a small broken sound, because he had felt it, the thing, the deeper-than-fear thing, come back up through his own hands from an animal his people had spent 1,000 years teaching him could not feel anything he would recognize. And he understood in that moment that he had been lied to about the shape of the whole world, and that the lie had a cost, and that he was going to spend the rest of his life paying it back one animal at a time. "You could come," Jonah told him low as they worked. "When I go, somewhere with Sky, I'm going to need hands that aren't afraid of them, and yours aren't. Not anymore." Ith was quiet a while. "My people need hands that aren't afraid of them more," he said finally. I think I have to stay and teach it, if I can. Someone has to be the first Casri who learned to sit down in the dark." He looked at the human. "You made that a thing a Casri can be. Before today it was not a thing a Casri could be." He went back to the salve. "I will stay, but I will come and find you sometimes where the sky is, to remember what I am doing it for." "I'd like that," Jonah said, and meant it. And they finished the work as the blood lamps guttered out and the real dark came down soft and clean over the floor. He walked out of the gray hold the next morning. He walked out through the great ceremonial doors at the top of the tiers, the ones the containment cohort had come through, and he walked out into the gray light of Vantes with his one stained smock and nothing else that was his. And around him and behind him came the pack. 50 of them and more. Some of the pens had held two. The whole loosed inventory of the adjudicate's power, moving through the halls of the gray hold in the disciplined half-circle they had formed on the sand, the venhounds screening forward, the war beasts on the flanks, and at the center the great gray bulk of Bram with the pup riding his shoulders now, and beside Bram the human with his hand resting easy on the ruined ear that would never be goaded again. Casri lined the halls to watch them go. They did not line them in fear, or not only in fear. They lined them the way you line a road for a thing you have never seen and will tell your grandchildren about. And some of them, here and there, without quite knowing why, held out an open hand as the human passed, palm up, empty, the way you hold a hand to a thing you want to trust you, and the beasts, passing, marked those open hands, and did not flinch from them. And something started in that gesture too, that morning, that spread further than any of them could have guessed. At the doors, Ossarin was waiting. She stood alone at the top of the tiers in her pale robes, old and small against the gray sky, and she watched the human and his pack come up the last of the stair. And when Jonah reached her he stopped, and the pack stopped behind him, and the two of them looked at each other one last time. "I have arranged transport," Oseran said. "A frontier lease past the far lanes, a world with, you said, sky. It has a great deal of sky. It is registered to you in freehold, which is a thing that has never once been granted to a human in the history of the conquered, and I have granted it, and let them argue with the record." Her flat old eyes moved over the pack, over Bram, over the pup, and stopped on the human. "I do not expect you to forgive us. I am not certain forgiveness is a thing that would even make sense to offer. I only wanted to stand here and see you go, so that the last thing I administer as first adjudicator is not a culling." "The last," Jonah said. "I am 1100 years old," said Oseran, "and I have learned one true thing yesterday at the very end, and I find I would rather spend what is left teaching it than administering an order I no longer believe in. I am giving it the bench." Something dry and almost warm moved across the ancient face. "He will be a catastrophe. He will be the best first adjudicator this hold has ever had. Those are, I have recently learned, frequently the same thing." She inclined her head, the small, deliberate, ruling gesture, one last time. "Go, human, take your pack and your sky. And when your kind and mine meet again in the far lanes, as we will, remember that one of us once was old enough to be wrong and honest enough to stop. It is not much. It is what I have." Jonah looked at her a moment. Then he reached out slow, the way he reached out to everything, so the thing being reached for could see the hand was empty, and he laid his open hand, just for a moment, flat against the old adjudicator's gray shoulder, the same gesture, the same open hand, the one that had started the whole day and would outlast all of them. "You stopped," he said. "That's the whole of it, first adjudicator, most never do, you stopped." He took his hand back. "That's not nothing, believe me. I'm the world expert on it." And he turned, and he walked out through the great doors into the sky, and the pack went with him. The world Oseran had signed over lay 4 jumps past the far lanes, and it had, as promised, a great deal of sky, a wide amber sky over a country of grass and stone and slow, cold rivers, empty of Kasrai, empty of goads, empty of everything except the weather and the work. Jonah named it nothing official. The conquered records called it the Veril Freehold, the first and for a long time the only piece of the galaxy a human held in his own name, and the pen hands who came out to it afterward, and they did come, freed from the reclamation yards and the physicians' halls as the ruling spread, drawn out past the lanes by the story of the barge hand and his beasts. The pen hands just called it the freehold, and later, as it grew, they called it home. It was not easy. 50 apex predators are not a thing you settle onto a grass world without cost, and the first year was all cost, learning what they would hunt and what they would not, what would kill the river stock and what would leave it, how to feed a pack that size through a cold season, which of the broken ones would heal in the open, and which carried wounds too deep in them to ever fully trust a hand again. Some of the war beasts never came all the way back. Jonah did not make them. He had never in his life made an animal be anything but what it was, and he was not going to start with the ones who had been hurt worst. He gave them a far corner of the freehold and the sky and no expectations, and he went out to them in the dark still, the way he always had, and sat with them and stayed, and that was enough, because it had always been enough, because it was the only thing that had ever been enough. Bram healed all the way. Jonah had known he would. The great gray animal took to the open country, the way a thing takes to the shape it was always meant for, and by the end of the first year, the ruined ear had gentled to a seam, and the amber eyes had cleared of the last of the pens, and he ranged the freehold at the head of the pack, as the thing he had been born to be before the Kasrai ever drove iron into his skull. Not the instrument, not the killer of 300. Just the oldest and largest, and most patient of a pack that had chosen its own life at last. He slept most nights against the wall of the low stone house Jonah built, his great flank rising and falling in the dark, and the last thing Jonah did every night before he slept was put his hand out the window onto the torn ear, and say the 2 soft words, and feel the huge, slow breath answer under his palm. And Fen grew. That was the thing the visitors always remarked on, in the years after, when they came out to the freehold to see with their own eyes the truth the relays had carried, the size of the young one. Fen grew the way his sire had grown, and then past it, because Fen grew in the open air on good feed with no spike in his skull and no cold cell to fold him small. And by his 3rd year, the pup that had fit inside a stockhand smock stood taller at the shoulder than Bram, the largest rendar anyone in the Concord had ever measured, a slate-gray mountain of an animal that could have opened any creature in the galaxy throat to tail, and who followed Jonah across the grass at a soft-footed amble with his enormous head down at the human's shoulder, churring the low questioning note, the one-word language, up at the end, exactly the way he had the night he learned it draped across a barge hands back in the dark. The biggest predator in the Concord, and he still climbed into Jonah's lap of an evening as if he were the size he'd been in the cistern, and crushed him flat, and Jonah let him, and swore at him, and held on to as much of the great skull as he could reach, careful, always, of the ears. It came sometimes as he'd promised. He came out from the gray hold every few years, in a plain ship, wearing plain clothes now instead of the gray. He had given the bench back after a while, having done the thing he set out to do, having made it a thing a Casri could be, and having trained enough others to be it that the Concord's pen stood empty across a dozen worlds, and he would sit with Jonah on the stone step in the amber evening, and watch the pack move across the grass and say very little, because they had never needed many words. And he would put his own gray hands out to Bram's ear before he left, the open hand, the thing that had spread from that one gesture on the floor to a dozen worlds, and then past them, the thing the Casri still called, solemnly, with the whole weight of their doctrine-making, the way of the ear touched. It meant by then more than it had that first day. It had come to mean a whole idea, an idea that had cracked the Concord's 1,000-year order down the middle and let something else grow up through it. That the floor under the world was not fear, had never been fear. That fear was only a thing you reached for when you had not yet learned to sit down in the dark and stay. The Casri were learning it, slowly, the way they learned everything. But they were learning it, and the pens were empty, and that was more than anyone standing on the culling floor that day would have dared to hope. Jonah did not think about it much, the bigness of what he'd started. It was not the kind of thing he thought about. He thought about the river stock and the cold season, and which of the broken ones had eaten that day, and whether the young war beast in the far corner had finally, after 4 years, let a hand touch its flank. He thought about the animals, one at a time in the dark, the way he always had, because that was the whole of him, and there was no number missing. And the thing he had shown the first adjudicator on the floor was the same thing he showed every hurt creature that ever found its way to the freehold. That he was not going anywhere, and that the hand coming toward it was empty, and that it could stop being afraid now, because someone had finally come who was only ever going to stay. He grew old there in the end, though that was very far off from the day on the floor, and he grew old the way he had lived, quiet and plain and surrounded, and the pack grew and turned over around him, generations of them, Fens get and Fens gets get, the whole long line of the freehold's beasts, and every one of them learned in the dark the same thing the first ones had learned, that there was a hand in the world that did not hurt. The story went out further than he ever knew. It went out on the relays and past them, to worlds that had never seen a Casri or a Rendar or a human, the story of the barge hand who was brought before the hostile court to be executed by a monster, and reached out and touched its ear, and how the monster came up out of its madness to meet the hand, and how the whole order of fear cracked open on the strength of one gentle thing done in the open where a dozen worlds could see it. But all of that was later, and larger, and Jonah would have waved it off. The thing itself, the true thing, the thing that was the whole of it, stayed small, the way true things do. It was a hand laid open on a torn ear in the dark. It was 2 soft words. It was a young man who had learned, on a cold stock barge a long way from any of this, that most mean things are only hurt things that have run out of people who will sit with them, and who had believed it hard enough and long enough, and in front of enough guns to make an entire fearful galaxy sit down in the dark at last and learn it too. On the last good evening of the first year, before any of the rest of it had happened, Jonah sat on the stone step of the half-built house with the amber sky going down over the grass and the pack settling around him for the night, and Finn, a warm growing weight across his shoulders, and Bram's great head come to rest in his lap. The ruined ear was healing. The pain was gone out of it for good. And the human put his open hand down flat against it, the way he had that first night in the dark, the way he would every night for the rest of his life, and the great gray animal let out a long, slow breath, and the young man leaned his forehead down against the huge warm skull, and said the only thing there had ever really been to say, the two words that had walked him toward a monster in front of a hostile court, and had never once, in all the world, turned into anything else. "I've got you," Jonah said, into the torn ear, into the dark, into the sky. "Easy, Bram, I've got you." And the beast that had been sent to kill him breathed out under his open hand, and was, at last, and for the rest of both their lives, entirely unafraid.